Excellent. Well, I really like everything you just said with the leaven and the Pharisees, and it speaks to a number of things. First off, I think too often, I think it's so important that when we talk about the bread of life, obviously that's talking about eating, Eucharist, digesting, but there's also something about bread that expands and that grows. And there's this question of kind of like the law or your worldview or your principle being something that grows within you, and it kind of is what expands and fills you, which is just as important, and that often is not thought. Like when we think about an idea of, let's take example, just that principle, the categorical imperative, do unto others what you, the golden rule. So let's just say the golden rule. Well, there's a golden rule that one is a principle that you operate according to. When you see people, you treat them well. But then there's also something growing within you that might be the kind of spirit that expects virtue to simply be principles that you can just follow thoughtlessly without thinking about it, right? You kind of grow, that kind of idea and notion grows within you, right? Likewise, if you say, oh, the only thing I can actually know is categories, I can't really know things outside of categories, then what grows within you is a kind of way of thinking where you only examine thoughts to thoughts, and you don't pay much attention to the details of the particular cat in front of you, because you only think about the category of cat. And so gradually what grows inside of you is a habit to ignore the world, because you can't know that with any certainty. But what you can know are the categories of cat. So you think about the categories, you play with the categories, and so on and so forth. Now, when Hegel comes along, and it would be another matter, but Hegel warns, he's like, are you so sure that thought and reality are separated? What if the very belief that all you can think is categories actually changes or participates in reality in such a way that it's different because you believe that you can only think category, as opposed to believe that thought participates in reality? Now, this is going to get us into different metaphysics. We could get in Burke's and Whitehead and different things. But basically, whether that's all true or not, the point that Hegel wants to point out is that there's an assumption there, that thought and being are really, really separated. And Hegel's like, what if nature and notion, or some of the language I'll use, what if nature and notion are always interpenetrating? What if you can't separate those things? Then actually, like Hegel would be like, hey, Kant, you're in the gutter. You don't know it, but you're in the gutter over there. You've separated them. Thus, you actually create a world where they seem separated, precisely because notion informs nature. And so nature presents itself as if it is separated from notion. And now you're in a gutter and can't know it, but you're able to do that precisely because nature and notion do inform one another. And so if you have the notion that only categories can inform one another, then that's how you experience nature. And Hegel's like, come on. And then, but, it goes from there. So likewise, if you get into the place where you have grow within you a kind of idea of the law that you can follow without thinking about it, well, then you actually then can treat yourself as a moral person as you pass the guy on the side of the road, because you're a moral person. You follow. There is no principle that says that's my neighbor. There is no principle, because if you go, what's very interesting, like when you go back, like I think it's Leviticus, where the neighbor is kind of defined as people that are part of your tribe, that are part of your community. And I think a way to read the movement from the Torah to the gospel is a kind of advancing of grace. Because if I say, hey, if somebody takes out your eye, don't kill them, just take out their eye. There's actually a grace in that. You don't kill them, just take out their eye, right? But then when you get to Jesus, he's like, oh, the standard's gone up. If they slap you, turn the other cheek. Grace has gotten more difficult now. It's kind of gone up now. And then it's like the divorce thing. He's like, it's because your hearts were too hard. That's why you could get the certificate. You weren't ready for this level of grace, right? So back then, you weren't ready to turn your cheek and have them slap the other one. So we had to tell you to take out their eye, but I'm here now. And so the standard's gone up. Grace is advanced. So likewise, what's so interesting is the neighbor, suddenly the parable of the Good Samaritan is so interesting, because when Jesus is asked, who is the neighbor? There's a blurring between the Good Samaritan being the neighbor and the guy on the side of the road. And as we know, Samaritans and Jews are not friends. That's why when Jesus meets the woman by the well, he's like, hey, Jews and Samaritans, they don't tend to get along. You know that, right? And so Jesus is like, hey, the Samaritan is and actually that's what he says. They say, so who was the neighbor? And they're like, the one who showed mercy. Go and do likewise. So he actually answers as if it is the Good Samaritan who is the neighbor, who is then showing you how to be neighborly. It's as if the parable is a double teaching on being neighborly and who is the neighbor. And of course, if your neighbor is someone outside of your tribe, in fact, it's someone who might be trying to kill you, this is a higher standard of loving the neighbor. It's moved from Leviticus to your neighbor being someone in your tribe. Now it's outside of your tribe, right? And that's really hard to do. We find that difficult to do. And what Jesus is almost also suggesting is that if you cannot love your neighbor, you cannot be neighborly. It's as if the act of loving your neighbor that is very difficult is precisely the precondition for being the kind of being who would actually stop and help someone on the side of the road. So there's a very interesting connection between those things that also suggests a kind of advancement of the standard of grace. Grace is the leaven that is growing. That is the bread that is expanding. That is the bread of life that is going through, and it's becoming more difficult, but it's also in that very difficulty, difficult because it breaks through simple formulations of what virtue is, simple sort of principles of treat others as you want to be treated. Don't ask, though, if you define the other only as people within your tribe. That's okay, right? It's like, that's what you do. And Jesus is like, nope. Grace is going to expand. The other is going to include the Samaritans who you would consider your enemy. And if you can't do that, if you can't even see the Samaritan as good, well, then you're not going to be capable of being a neighbor or being neighborly to help someone on the side of the road that doesn't fit into a simple principle. So what you see is kind of as the leaven of the Pharisees grows as law, what we have counter here is like grace is actually growing, and the gospel is the story of grace developing. But here's the key. It's always gathering up, because you are only ready to move into taking care of this person on the side of the road if you've gone through the historic period of learning how to treat the people in your neighbor, your tribe, right? So there has to be a gathering. Hegel talks about sublation. You cannot, and that's why also when Jesus is like, I don't remove an iota of the law, the law is always there. A way I think about this is how you have to have the inside of a tree that's arguably kind of dead to be the structure so you can have the alive bark on the outside. There's no structure without the inside, right? You need law in order to hold the grace together, right? So the law provides the structure of grace, and grace is gathering up sublatively everything that came before it, because you have to go what came before it to be ready for what comes next. If you skip what came before it, you can't be ready for what's next. And the reason why it's interesting, it seems like virtue can't be taught and yet it can be taught, is because virtue is that movement of grace itself. You can't teach all of virtue as a point. You have to keep going and apprehending glimmers of it along the way. And the end of it, and then I'll give it back to you, the gathering image I think about a lot is in Dante, where it's suggested at the top of the Paradiso, when you look back, it looks like all layers of the Paradiso are equal. Because there's this interesting question of how can you have hierarchy in heaven, and yet also not have people on lower rungs of the hierarchy feel like they missed out. It's interesting because at the top, when Dante looks back, it then is all parallel. It's like you go from, when you climb, there are different levels, but then from the top, you see how it's all gathered and there's actually an equality in the circle being gathered together. So likewise, it's funny, as you advance through grace, when you look back, you see how it's all part of, it's all equally as important, and yet there is simultaneously levels that are going on. So there's this gathering that when you look back, you see it all held together, but as you went, there was an advancement in it at the same time. Likewise, as you climb in Dante, the Paradiso, and you get to the top, you can then see all the circles of the Paradiso gathered together at the top, where it's the circles and the circles going together. But I think seeing it as a movement of grace can also point to why virtue is something you can learn, but then at the same time, it's something you can't stop. It's learning, but you also have to keep going. The moment you stop, because you say, it's kind of like this. The moment you say, I'm virtuous, I've learned what it is. Well, now it's gone. The moment you say, now I have it, it's gone. Likewise, the moment you say, now I have grace, it's like, no, you don't have grace. It's always given to you by the Spirit. You got to keep going in a posture of receiving. And the moment you stop having that posture of receiving and maybe just kind of rely on categories, different things, then it's gone. Likewise, the moment of friendship, and then I'll give it back to you, the moment you say, you're friends, it kind of dies, because then the category does your work for you, right? Like instead, the category does your work for you. So likewise, when you say, I'm virtuous, the category of being virtuous does your work for you, right? So there's always this gathering up of grace this is the key. Gathering holds you without categorizing. That's the trick. How do you have things hold together without it turning into a category that then you outsource your thinking to? Well, that's the movement. Movement carries. Like if I throw a ball, the ball stays in the air even if nothing is holding it up, right? So likewise, what happens when you're in the movement of grace, or you're in the movement of seeking the good, the true, and the beautiful, that very movement keeps you going and keeps you held without a category. Because the moment you have a category hold you, the moment you have the law hold you, then what starts growing within you is someone who doesn't move. What starts growing within you is something that relies on an outer principle. So Jesus is rejecting that, and instead the other thing, and then, it's interesting, a parable gathers you too, right? It's like DC Similar was saying with Plato, when he has a questioning, everyone in the community is gathered under the question. So likewise, when Jesus has a parable, he's gathering you under the, what the heck does this mean? We're all wondering about this now. What does that mean? So there's a gathering in the parable, and the way that there's a gathering in the grace, and the parable pushes you out of simple category thinking in the same way that grace pushes you out simple category thinking, and the life is in the move. The life is in that very dance. So there's a structural matching, I think, of Jesus's parable with also the arc of the scripture as a whole.
And to that point, I think this reinforces your argument. In that passage from Exodus where they're leaving Egypt and they're given the law by which they will remember without external access to a mnemonic device, the thing that makes mnemonic device is the hand, the thing that witnesses the mnemonic device, the eye, and the thing that reproduces the propaganda of the mnemonic, the thing that Marshall McLuhan would be happy to call either hot or cold, that is not there to be pressed down and tape recorded. It's in the mouth. And the neat thing about how it was said back then is it was said with these Monet quick brush strokes, outlines, elements, that if one's not careful, one begins to add to and make it thick and thick. Hey, we're going somewhere with this, right? They meant to make it this. They meant to make it an elephant, didn't they? Because it's got this little curve here and it's got this big stalk there, and that's not a tree. That's the leg of the elephant. So you see, it's coming together. And I know, I know. And as you said, now I'm not moving anymore. As I am not moving, the text, the law is becoming thicker and thicker and more real seeming. And now it's in the way. And as you said so profoundly, there is no advancement. I've arrived. And the Greek aorist tense of I see is now equivalent to Kierkegaard's not knowing that you're in despair while being in despair. I see that I do not see, and I do not know that I do not see. I do not see that I do not see, and I am seeing, and I do not. Oh my goodness! I mean, that's a strange place to be. With that said, in fact, Jesus said it's a thick heart. It's a fatty heart. One way to talk about that thickness. I don't think it's accidental. All right, these thickening agents. Okay. Where I was going with all of that is the detail that I think comes back to your point, because as you were talking about that transcendental movement, or the transcendentals allowing us to move without being in the airplane, pun on that word plane, of a category, a position, a relation, past, present, future, position. That would be to look at one's ego or one's appendage or one's soul or whatever whatever one calls it, a Zeno's arrow, right? Instead of having one arrow that goes somewhere, you have an infinite number of arrows that go nowhere. And now we have the problem, which isn't a problem in Wittgensteinian terms, but feels like a problem because now it's so thick with all these arrows that are the one arrow of the problem. You see how we now arrive at a false arriving at the problem of the one and the many, because we're arriving at, in Hegelian terms, from the non-starter. We're not even starting the dialectic in Hegelian terms. We think we've went quite far, and this is where Kierkegaard comes in with his irony. We think we've gone beyond, but we haven't even started. We think we have all these arrows, and now it's a question of how does the many relate to the one arrow, but we haven't even decided movement, which is a strange place to be. And I think it comes back to that law is filled up so much that there's no going anywhere. We have Jerusalem without having Jerusalem. All right. The detail, which is not incidental in that part of Exodus, is, and I think this relates philosophically, I think perhaps everything was in the Torah. And as you said, now is growing and actually being fulfilled, as Jesus said, with his incarnation, I would say. All right. It was the season of new grains when they left Egypt. Here's what I would say. Season of new grains is a profound Monet quick brushstroke of the problem of the one and the many, and having many instances of the one. You can see visually a grain. And the idea of season is the same, but it's a new same. But it's the same, but it's a new same. We don't have the old grain anymore, but it's still grain. So it's Zeno's arrows, except with grain. But here I'm going to use the same installment so that one remembers not to have leaven, which is thick and many. So it's such a profound way to talk through the concrete grain about what the Greeks talk about later. I'm blown away by the parataxis. Just says these things one after the other. And of course, it's taken up, to use your language. When they cross the river, they mention the fact that they have no bread. It didn't carry over. What carried over was the absence, the not fulfilled, the not being there. And then Jesus uses that not being there to talk about what is there, but doesn't seem to be there. But then you brought up how the other kind of leavening agent is in fact grace. And now I'm starting to see where the Hegelian movement comes in your thought, and I appreciate it. I'm appreciating Hegel through you, Daniel. So then I would ask you, what is the way to keep going forward? And how can we continue to break, how can I continue to break the brittle surface of my categories? Because I used to think, well, if I go on Facebook and I have friends, then I have friends. But all Facebook is teaching me, causing me to learn, leavening in me, dropping little drops of law in me to expand over time, is as long as you have a group under a heading, you can come back to that group under the heading. Some will leave, but who cares? You still have that group. Even if you only have one, you've actually solved the problem of the one and the many. And it's only now a matter of time, because you've built the heading, as Field of Dreams says, they will come. And that is to unlearn all these sophisticated ways to synoptically appreciate that nothing is lost with Jesus. When he says, if you are slapped, turn the other cheek, he is doing so many things at once, paratactically, because the image of the face is a fullness. So if you're hit on one, you're supposed to offer the other, which is another way of commenting on this gathering up that you're talking about. It's manifold, wow. But now seeing that manifoldness, I would start to think it corresponds to something internally changing, does it not? And how does this now redound to the community? And the community give and take with it at the individual level.
Beautiful. So everything you said was magnificent. There's a few things. First off, the airplane plane was really nice. The airplane, like a plane that you're following on, that was really good. And I really like as well this idea that the category is a false solution to the one and the many. You have the one and the many are under it. That's really nice, because I think that is the temptation of the category, is it seems to solve the problem of the one and the many. But it really doesn't. It actually slips away. It slips away the problem by making you think you've solved it. But what it's actually done is gotten rid of the many, because they're just category. There is no many. They're just the category. It's a sleight of hand that occurs. That's really good. The other thing I'll note is I think part of the problem is when Jesus talks about the fulfillment of the law, I think what we hear is he put a check mark and he threw it off the desk. It's filled, it's done, we're done with it, right? I think that metaphor is incorrect. I think a better way to think about it is, I'll use wrestling because I wrestled for a bunch of years. The match is the fulfillment of the practice. Like you go, like the match is the fulfillment of the practice. The whole point of the law was precisely to work you to the place where you could handle the grace. Like without the law, you would have never been ready for the match of the grace. So you can't say, oh, the law was a mistake. Jesus is like, if there's no law, you're not going to be ready for grace. You think you can handle never getting a divorce before you go through a period where you even have to sign a certificate? You'd never be ready for it. The law makes possible the grace. So this is a mistake. Christians are like, oh, but the law is death. Like there's a way in which practice, I can tell you that practice was death for wrestling. It was absolutely death. You were running the bleachers. Like Paul is like, the law was death. Yeah, oh yeah, it sucks. But that is why you were strong in the match. Right. So precisely the difficulty of the law, precisely the practice that went into that in the very effort and the realization that, oh my gosh, I can't do it. I'm not ready. Oh, well, you're ready for the match now, because the match is actually communion with God. The match is a relationship with God, which if you never went through the practice of failure to then be humble for God and also working to be, like, it's not where Jesus is saying the law is still there. You need to work at these things to be more loving and more kind. These works do matter, even if good works can never replace the grace of Christ, right? There's always that tension between faith and works. But there is this idea that there is something in the practice of the law that conditions you in manners to be ready for the match of grace. And this is what's very interesting. This is where it seems to be multi-leveled, because learning your inability to fulfill the law is in itself something that you have to practice to innerly change yourself to realize you're not better than other people. Like that humility, so you don't have that kind of Pharisee Sadducee supremacy, that failure is part of the lesson. That, though, is something we don't get in. That's what can be lost, though, in kind of moral theory, where we don't actually think of the idea of failing to be fully moral in of itself is the tilling of the ground for being virtuous, because now you have humility. Now you don't see yourself as better than other people. And if you don't see yourself as better as other people, then you actually might stop for the guy on the side of the road. You may actually be able to love the Samaritan who's supposed to be your enemy, because you go, wait a minute, I'm not better than other people because I'm not able to fulfill the law perfectly. So who am I to say that the Samaritan can't be good? Who am I to think these ways? So what you have there is Jesus's teaching has to be both on the place of here's what it means to be like Christ, but also you have to go through a historic period where you encounter your limitations, because the very encounter of those limitations is part of the practice that makes you ready for the match of trying to be like Christ in relationship and openness to the Holy Spirit while not being prideful. That fullness of speaking to every layer of the human being is what is necessary for the address. Because if I don't speak to you spiritually, mentally, and all of those different levels, then I can't address what it means to be human, and you certainly won't be capable of addressing other people. To clarify the point as well, in Hegel, there's this idea that the encounter of limits is an advancement. When you find out what you cannot do, that actually means you gain positive knowledge. When consciousness finds out that it actually cannot enter the minds of other people, consciousness has sublated. The learning of the limit then gets incorporated into consciousness, and now in a way it's actually crossed that limit, because now it's heading in a direction where it's not trying to occupy the minds of other people because it knows it can't do that. Instead, it's trying to figure out, how do I relate to other people who must always be a mystery to me? Hegel's like, you have a temptation. You can say other people don't exist, And so then Hegel makes the choice between self-consciousness and reason, the choice that otherness exists. That's the big move. The conscious chooses to believe that other minds exist. And the consciousness, or the subject that chooses to believe other minds exist, develops differently than the subject who says other minds don't exist, right? Same situation. You can't enter the minds of other people, but an entirely different choice in how you respond to the encounter of that limit. And so the encounter of the limit then makes possible the choice that changes how consciousness develops. And now it can move for Hegel into reason, spirit, religion, absolute, etc., so forth. So likewise, once you encounter, wait a minute, I can't fulfill the law perfectly, there's a limit, there's two choices. One, you accept the need for Jesus and to be like Jesus and to follow his grace and the Holy Spirit. Or two, you say, well, that's because it's all stupid. You just kind of throw it out, or you hunker down, I guess there's a third option, and deny your inability to fulfill the law by adding an exception and adding a new law that you're good at and adding and adding and adding and adding. And that's what basically Jesus is saying. He's like, you Pharisees and Sadducees have been adding to the law these new traditions and different things, like washing your hands before you eat. That's one Jesus goes after, because he's like, God never said that. That just came from your tradition. Like, that's not something you decided to add that and treat that as authoritative. So you're adding things that then you're superior at to cover up your inability to actually be holy. You're adding and adding and adding, and you're not letting the realization that you can't be fully holy because you're fallen and because no one can but Jesus and by his Spirit. You're keeping yourself from encountering that limit by just adding and adding and adding, as opposed to dwelling in that limitation, which then the other temptation is to hide that limitation and that lack with categories. I'm holy, I'm under that category, therefore there's nothing wrong with me. Oh, I've done what I'm supposed to do, one in the many, I've done many things, but they're all under the category of holiness. They're under the category of being the good religious followers. So now you're done, you're safe, right? Shatters all of that. And I think basically what also happens, and then I'll give it back to you, is it's very much in human nature to try to create ways to where when we encounter our limit, that doesn't, like the Rilke poem, make us say we must change our life. The encounter of the limit means that the other person is doing something wrong, because otherwise we wouldn't have encountered that limit. They're not doing what they're supposed to do, right? So like, for example, when you encounter someone who has different beliefs than you, you say, well, this is because they don't think like me. So if I make them think like me, they won't be a limit anymore. They won't be different. The Pharisees and the Sadducees, they encounter the followers of Jesus, they're not washing their hands. You say, well, this is because they're not like me. They need to be like me, and there won't be a problem, right? You're encountering a limit to how you think the world should be with another person's world that you're then encountering, right? So you can solve that problem simply by defining your world as the holy one, as the right one, and they're outside of it. And they're not solving the problem of the one and the many, because they're not under the category that then solves the problem of the one and the many. So you need to force them in or to kick them out. I think basically one of the reasons, like, to the question then of how to move forward, like how to kind of advance the communal question and different things, I think the first thing I would say is all of that dynamic that we just described falls under a kind of mistaken structure of basically what theology, if you want to say, is in the business of, in the same way that you see a similar structure happen with a mistaken idea of what philosophy is in the business of. Philosophy is not about creating categories or systems building or getting the kind of like, here's the true version of the world. Because when we do that as human beings, we tend to make the world fit into our theory as opposed to conform our theory to the world, right? The way I like to think about philosophy generally is to break it down. It starts with what, you could say wonder, Socrates. So wonder, oh my gosh, this is being. Wow, what is justice? I've used this all my life. Now I don't know what it is. So now you have the wonder. The second thing I would actually talk about is almost Heidegger's clearing, which I think the clearing of Heidegger is more important than being, the later Heidegger, which is where you clear your ideas of how the world is. You make a kind of forced clearing so that being can disclose itself. So you clear. And then, so you have these ideas of what reality is, and you get those out of your head, you clear aside your categories, you have the wonder, now you're creating a clearing to sustain the wonder. Then you enter into, like Javier Rivera will talk about with the Martin Buber waiting, where you wait, which is a deep ontological waiting, a sort of patience, a waiting on the Lord, 400 years, the Holy Spirit, the waiting on the Lord. And then you have to engage in the David Hume self-defense, because for David Hume, philosophy is a matter of self-defense of the people that want to come in and take your clearing, or to replace it with an idea of how the world works. So you have the wonder.
Foxes in our garden.
Yes, that's exactly right. And you're trying to fight those off. One of the reasons Hume argues you can't get from ought to is because he wants to say you can only get to ought from suchness, the immediate particularity of a common life. He's saying you cannot, he's really, really concerned about categories of what the human is that is created by a central planner who says this is what the human is, therefore they ought to do this. David Hume is like, no, you can never get from is to ought, because that's a recipe for totalitarian control. You can only get to ought from suchness, the particular cat down by the barn, the particular car that's not working. Then you determine this car is missing a tire, therefore we ought to get it a new tire. Well, that's not the category of cars. That's the particular Oldsmobile in its suchness that then you determine oughtness. And for David Hume, this is self-defense. You're protecting yourself from categories that people are going to impose on you. And because you fall under those categories, this is what you ought to do. So there's a wonder, clearing, waiting, self-defense that philosophy is supposed to be engaged in, for the disclosure of beauty, truth, and goodness on its own terms. This is the key. If you have that clearing, then being discloses itself to you as you wait, as opposed to you go to it and try to create it, right? You're waiting for grace to develop. You're waiting for the Spirit to come, as opposed to looking for it. So when you're in that clearing, instead of philosophy trying to figure out what truth is, you're waiting for truth to disclose itself in its suchness. It comes forth in the world. The wonder comes forth. You cannot go and find truth. What you can do is create a clearing that then maintains the conditions, and then you condition yourself to handle the truth and recognize truth when it discloses itself. But then you have to be patient on the Lord, per se. You have to be patient on the Spirit and to move on its own times. Likewise, theology is to do something very similar. You're supposed to be taken by the beauty of the Lord, the wonder, who is this guy Jesus? Then you clear your ideas of who you think God is and what God ought to do. You clear your preconceived religious notions. Then you wait in that clearing for the Scripture to speak to you, for it to come forth in a new way. And you self-defend as people come in and say you're wasting your time, or you're interpreting that picture incorrectly, or no, it's really simple. This is what the Bible says, right? You defend yourself from that and reside in a place of that clearing, so that then the Spirit can move in you, so that the Bible can speak anew. And so likewise, Jesus is so often with these parables, he's like creating a story that creates a kind of confusion, or like, what does this parable mean? Then he's like, dwell in it, clear everyone aside who wants to just tell you what the meaning of the parable is and be done with it. Wait in that not sure what it is, and defend yourself from anyone who wants to just give you simple moral theories about what you're supposed to do. He wants you to dwell in the story, wait in that dwelling until you wrestle with it to a place where something comes forth from that wrestling, and that's the movement of grace. And all of that is the match to be able to do that sort of thing, that you go through the practicing of the law to get to where you can handle doing that kind of thing. In the same way that you engage in reading philosophies and going through all the different systems of these thinkers, precisely get to the place where you say, no, that's inadequate. No, that's not what philosophy is supposed to be. You hit the limit of what those systems can do, and then you go back to the original feeling of the wonder, create the clearing of that wonder, and then you wait and defend that space. And so philosophy, first of all, needs to be presented as doing that, and arguably also theology and religion as doing that. And then if we ourselves can do that and show that alternative way of approaching, say, God or philosophy, well, then the community can see it, right? Like, you can't change a community if you yourself don't have the right ways of carrying yourself in the world, right? And really, a lot of the problem is we're carrying ourselves in the world in a manner that we can feel like we're not doing something wrong because it falls under a certain category. Oh, I know that this is what the community thinks is Christian, so if I follow these actions, I'll be under that category, and I know I won't be doing something wrong. Well, the problem is you're not engaging in those activities that we said. You're just letting the category go. And that doesn't mean the category is entirely wrong. Maybe the category is entirely right. Maybe it actually is all based on accurate interpretations of the Scripture. Yeah, but the mode you have is externalizing the thinking to the category. Therefore, the bread that grows within you is one of externalization. You don't have the mode of going into the world in a manner that treats it like a mystery that you need to wait on and let disclose itself. So even if you're living the virtuous way, what's not growing within you is the mode that is needed for the community and other people to live in a manner so that the world can disclose itself to them in a different manner, right? So this is where, and that to me, then, that's what you're trying to spread, really. Like a mode of which participates in virtue, but it does so in a manner that also grows within one a kind of self that does not rely on external categories, that does not rely on external things, that keeps you from risk, keeps you from acting in a manner that requires courage, frankly, and from acting in a manner that doesn't allow for grace to disclose itself in new and unknown ways, right? Well, that's all frightening, of course, but I think courage, it's hard to have virtue where there's not courage. And there has to be a kind of mode of which requires a courage, of which if you're doing the virtuous acts, but you don't have that courage going on, there's something lost in that virtue that needs to be spread. So I think that mode, the first thing I would say is getting those kind of proper understandings of theology and philosophy, which I think are shown in the person of Christ. And then I think in philosophy, if we think Socrates, Heidegger, Buber, and Hume, just, I'm not saying those are the only ones, but to me, that's a kind of model. Well, now there's a presenting of a horizon of life that can be spread to the community that might start to show a different way. And then, of course, if we cannot rely so much on external categories, then we have to face the other person more. We have to pay attention to the suchness of the people around us and respond to that and to really be present there, because that's what we have. It's all suchness then. There isn't isness. There isn't categories. There's the suchness. So you're more immediate. And I like your point as well that the face is a symbol of the whole person. When somebody slaps the face, it's actually, like you're saying, it's not just the face, it's the whole person that Jesus is speaking to. So likewise, we have to have a kind of mode of being where we use theology and philosophy in a manner that makes us better at looking at the face, of facing the face, and being the kind of person that can be slapped on the face and then offer our face again. And that would be the question of what's the best way to go about theology, philosophy, and then life in general, so that we would be so capable and so conditioned.
And this, to me, suggests what you said and how you said it, a proof to my idiosyncratic proclivities or predilections, or the things that I succumb to in persuasion, that of all the religions, wherever one begins in Christianity, one finds that as they learn that their learning is helping them. Without exception. It sounds like a given, but try going to the library and picking a random book and flipping open the page and studying the page. There might be some neat things, but does one have this continuous learning that while I'm learning, what I'm learning is helping me, is healing me, is part of a therapeutic regime? Now, that's a hypothesis because I'm not at the end of the road, but a righteous man has regard for the life of his animal. And one could say, oh, it cares about our dogs, cares about the rabbits. But what happens when there are too many rabbits? There's a problem because I have these vegetables and they're eating my vegetables. It's not my animal. They're my vegetables and it's my family. So I'm learning how to take this law and begin to see that nature is a war of all against all. That's the wrong direction. Perhaps what I'm being taught with a righteous man has regard for the life of his animal, that there are levels to this game. of creation. There's my animal, and then I'm an animal to what made me. I'm an in-soul, to use the Greek, animus. And perhaps my creator has regard for my life. And so he gives me perimeters so that I may grow, and then the perimeters begin to go wherever they need to go. And that is an expression of the regard for the life, not the form, but the life. So now earlier you had said, with respect to humility, who am I to say? Well, note it. I think it's one of the beautiful ways the Bible, beyond the Bible, one of the beautiful ways Christianity, and what I mean by Christianity is from Adam to now, the cosmos, to use Saint Maximus, the all that is being gathered up. I have to go pretty soon, but I'm so taken by what you said about self-defense with respect to Hume. I'm going to crib that from you. It's so helpful. That's why I'm on this kick about helpfulness. I haven't heard Hume explained that way before. Thank you. Do you have books to this effect?
Well, you're very kind. So a few that first, I hope. So Norman Kemp Smith, Donald Livingston, there are some really good Hume scholars, and hopefully the paper Deconstructing Common Life at the End of Conflict of Mind really talks about this. The key principle of David Hume is common life, where for him, there's the difference between good philosophy and bad philosophy is bad philosophy replaces common life with philosophy, where good philosophy defends common life in its common life and suchness and particularity. I basically think the entire Scottish Enlightenment tends to unfortunately be read as a footnote to the Enlightenment, Kant and all these different people, which is problematic, because then we don't see how they're part of the tradition where they see the greatest problem of philosophy is philosophy itself. And yet you cannot avoid philosophy, because you have to think and you have to have a system. So how do you go about the right relation to something you cannot avoid that's dangerous? That's where David Hume has the philosophical journey. And it requires, you need to go on philosophy, because without philosophy, you're vulnerable to outside forces and you can be thoughtless, the banality of evil, Hannah Arendt kind of problem. But then once you leave on the philosophical journey, you can think you're superior to other people because you're philosophical. So then for him, the philosopher has to come back and embed in common life. And if you do not do that, philosophy he basically predicts he predicts the totalitarian movements, because for him, critically, the only possibility of total war requires philosophy, because only philosophy is not conditioned. It is not conditioned, it can be universal. So for war and power to become like total, it will require philosophy. But then philosophy is also the only thing that can stop it, right? So the whole Scottish Enlightenment, and then I would also argue what I like to call the entire modern counter-enlightenment, with like Michel Planier, Blondel, Fontaine, all these different people are also warning about this radical problem of philosophy. I know you have to go, and I have really enjoyed speaking to you. I think also when philosophy realizes its own limit, then philosophy changes in character. That's what and Hegel's going to agree with Hume. When philosophy realizes, oh, wait, I have a tendency to become totalitarian unless I embed myself in common life, that is something that philosophy had to go through philosophy to encounter, so then it could turn into the good philosophy of which defends common life and brings out the wonder of common life. Likewise, you have to go through law to get to the place where you go, oh, wait, law actually can become its own worst enemy because we use it for arrogance, superiority, and to control other people. Well, that you had to go through law to then realize the right relation of law, which is a clearing for grace. But that required going through law to hit the limitation of law as being what could perfect a people, so that then you see that the role of law is to prepare and to fulfill itself at the clearing for grace. And that as philosophy realizes its own limit and changes in character and quality, so law can change its character and quality. And then it actually turns out that law all along was a grace. It was grace in a historic moment of law that was developing to the place where it could then be free of the law, like a seed that's growing. Likewise, true philosophy goes through the bad philosophy to then unveil what was always already the case in philosophy, which was the potential of being a source of wonder and self-defense from outside forces. And this is the gathering where what happens is history goes forth to unveil. You have to go through time to unveil what was always there. You cannot start with what was always there because there is no always yet. Always there requires the going through of time so that it can develop. There is no flower in a seed until time. The potential for the flower is arguably in the seed, but it's not, the flower is not in the seed. It is the development and the unfurling of the seed into a flower. And in that very unfurling, that sublation, you have the one and the many. The one of the seed always had the many of the petals, the stem, the flower, the possible situation of experiencing the flower. Those things then open up. And we have to think, I think, about that is what we have to, like, we have to think about religion, theology, and philosophy as something that is opening up, not something that is stagnant. And that, if you tell people that, well, then people would want to be part of the communities where that's being realized. They would, and then there can actually be the possibility of friendships in the common commitment to that opening up of the seed, in that development and different things. And so I think also this kind of correct understanding of theology and philosophy and thinking in general is strongly tied to then communities of friendship, as opposed to communities that are simply people gathered under the category of community, because there's something that we are then collectively honoring. And I think it is difficult to have friendship without a collective honoring.
The use of the word honoring was a zinger for me. Thank you. So I want to be intentional about my takeaways here because I've learned a great deal here. The stalactites of honey dripping. The clearing out and the waiting. Well, these map on, in my mind, to the virtue of patience and vigilance, which you could probably honeycomb courage in with different shapes to vigilance, because there are a number of courageous ways to be vigilant. Because in my simple mind, I ask, well, what am I supposed to do? And that intransitive to do, it's very permeable. Suggestions from the out, projections from within, and lint can be mistaken for fool's gold, which can be mistaken for the last word on the dragon. So how do we ground ourselves with each other in the cacophony of possibilities? Well, I think in summary, we've arrived at the notion that our nature is not susceptible to the explanatory power of Kantian overview. And I would say that part of the reason for the wrongly termed, because it wasn't measured adequately or correctly, limit of the Kantian scope was he was drawing his inferential habit not from himself, but from a sort of envy or a sort of, why can't it be this simple? That was his acquisition of the calculus, or his acquisition of certain geographical parts in books, because he studied geography, I've read. And with your notion of the time is well spent clearing out, that gives me something to do. But then it dangles that carrot from heaven before me that if I do this and wait, thank God, something different will happen. I won't have the experience in the igloo where I'm waiting. I will have this wonderful in common life waiting, full of different things, but somehow the same, which makes the vigilance easier to bear, which makes the cross still a cross, but also the tree of life. I don't pretend to know how that's possible, because it's not a category of thought. It's not an antinomy. It's not two laws that just magnetically repel: cross, tree, death, life. It's something else entirely. Well, also with what you've said, it's not lost on me that in the Gospel of Matthew, here we are addressing an audience that is familiar with the law and familiar with it as not a Kantian propedeutic to a future metaphysic, a closure, in other words, but to a pedagogy for keeping. All right. And in that keeping, there is a recognition of its growth, as you would keep a garden. Okay. And a garden is a wonderful thing where the categories meet reality in real time. So in that book, where these laws do not have to be stated one after the other because the audience already knows them, and not only knows them, but through generation after generation, they have built the bread, eaten the bread, seen the different seasons of new grain. They saw that Xenozero go back and forth in their own paralogisms. To this, we have the added genre, which is not so pronounced in the other Gospels, of the parable. Sure, there are more in Luke, but they're next to the law in Matthew, and I think they have a different function than. But what I really want to say is, when you put Matthew next to John, Matthew has those parables, and John has conversation from God. I am the vine, you are the branches. Whereas in Matthew, consider the lilies, consider the birds. A man went to sow. It's this distance, it's this outline, it's this, we're going to go down that historical road you took time to outline yourself in your conversation with me. We're going to honor that by recapitulating it here. But now, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. Didn't he just say the same thing twice? I've learned so much about how subtle those books are. Thank you. We should talk again.
I think we should. I've enjoyed it very much, Matthew. Everything you said, you're very kind, and I really like the point. You've said so many great things on the category, the kind of false solving of the one of the many. I really like that. I really like, well, in the other thing, like the gutter, that's really good also, with the gutter is parallel with the laying. I think that's really insightful, because it has to be parallel, otherwise you wouldn't make the mistake. And it also speaks to the privation. I think that's exactly right. Well, the last thing I'll say that I think it's pointed at, we've forgotten that we're constantly surrounded by things that are here and not here at the same time. And as a result, we don't understand why the clearing works. Because if you are mostly, so the example I was thinking about is the act of remembering. Before the book was printed, an act of remembering was also a kind of bringing the past into the present. Like, now it kind of feels like the past is over there. Like, it's in the book. It's actually in the past. Like, it's almost like feels more like you're going to the past when you read a history book. Whereas orally, it would always feel like the invisible has been made present. The past that is always there is now meeting it. Like, remember is like reattached a member of the body. Reintroduce a member of the community. They're here now. Where, like, memory, what's so mysterious about memory is you're actually not going to the past when you have the memory of the birthday. You're here in the present, having a memory of being in the birthday. You're bringing time and past together. It feels like, because you can only see the image of the birthday and everything around you does this weird thing where it's invisible but not invisible. Like, one of the most mysterious acts of all is the reading of a book and having a movie play in your head. Like, when you read, like, Lord of the Rings, you're in the Shire. This makes no sense. yet it's happening. You're reading black marks on a page and you're not reading black marks on a page. That double space right there, that is the phenomenological spirit, that's experience that I think Plato is getting at with the math, with the remembering, with the past, with virtue. There's some double move that occurs where you are not here and here at the same time, which means you're actually embodying the metaphysical condition that you're always in. Because you're constantly surrounded by the past that's not there. There's something you want that's not here. You're toward a God that's here and not here at the same time, but it's kind of more outside. But in the act of remembering or reading the book, you kind of more vividly and directly participate in the here, not here at the same time. That actually is constantly categorizing the metaphysical condition that you are in. It's more difficult, I think, today to see the weirdness of remembering actually because of the printing of a book, because it literally feels like the past is there when you go and read. You don't have to bring it to you in your present moment. But when you remember something, it's a bringing, it is precisely a present absence. The past and present are one. When you are thinking of the future, you are bringing the past and present together at the same time. And so this seems to be the kind of act, I'll close on this. This is the act that seems to be ground zero of the mystery that is the human being, that also seems to be the mastering of which leads to more virtue, leads to more experiences of beauty, leads to more goodness, and leads to more conditioning oneself in such a manner that they can spread it to the community and spread it back to them. This mysterious doubleness, and then it's like the spirit dwells in you. You're like, what does that mean? Yeah, it's a doubleness. The spirit's in you and not in you. The always, already, not yet, the doubleness, right? You're a sinner, but also saved. Yeah, the doubleness, right? You're reading a book and there's a movie playing in your head. Yeah, the doubleness, right? You know this is virtuous, but you can't explain it. How is that possible? Yeah, that's the doubleness. The doubleness, this doubleness phenomenology is the ground zero, I think, of the question of these things that seem to be the most important things in life. And the more we own that and the more we pay attention to it, I think the better we'll get at it. So I appreciate the conversation very much, Matthew. Enjoyed it very much, and I hope we can do it again.
Same. Have a great day.
You too, Matthew. Daniel. Thank you, sir.